chapter 19, beginning verses number 9. And when ye reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of thy vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord your God. Now, in context, God is commanding the reapers of the harvest to leave a little of the fruits of their labor, such as grain, grapes, corn, etc. Leave the corners of their field open for the poor and strangers to take from. The definition of the word glean would be to collect things that are thinly scattered, to gather what is left in small parcels or numbers. And I start with that is because if you were here a couple of Sundays ago, our brother Isaac preached on Ruth and the redemption through Boaz. So I'm going to kind of glean from what little, that I have to glean from. But yeah, so I just want to thank you all for coming out here tonight. It was a little rainy, but I appreciate you all showing up. It's an encouragement to me. And here at University, the members, y'all never cease to amaze me, and the love that you constantly show for me, the support that you have, and I just thank God for it all. So we're going to be dealing with the book of Ruth again. So Ruth it's a short book on love, as is the whole Bible. But this, particularly like this book, and I kind of fell in love with it myself. Although it barely mentions God, but we see it shows God's providence in the life of Naomi through Boaz and Ruth. The theme on tonight is flawed, not failed. Now, our previous speakers did an excellent job on the characters selected. First, we'd had Brother Jonathan Banning speaking on Sarah, who Sashak or laughed at the promise of God until she realized her flaw and decided to have faith in what God has promised. And as the book of Hebrews will say in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11, through faith, also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age because she judged him faithful who had promised. Last week we had Phil Robertson concerning Jacob, speaking on Jacob or Israel, who many, if not all of us, can relate to concerning our many flaws, countless flaws that we have made. Jacob, he was known as a cheater, a deceiver. He would trade his birthright from Esau, and he steals his blessing from Esau. Steals the blessing from Esau, and he runs away from his family. All these different things, and that's just a couple of them. In Genesis 32, he's known as physically wrestling with the Lord. Now, sometime after his wrestle, he seems to realize his flaw in not being able to win against God and to strive to do better. First, he would trade his birthright from Esau and steal the blessing from Esau. But after his wrestle with God, he would be reconciled with Esau. He runs away from his family at first, but now, after he wrestles with God, he would move his family from Egypt. And in verse 21, in the Hall of Fame of having faith, in verses 21, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning upon the top of his staff. He would, by faith, do it God's way instead of doing it his own way. Flawed, not failed. Now, when we get to the book of Ruth, however, I chose to be the oddball and pick Ruth because necessarily she doesn't really have any character flaws revealed in the Bible other than who she was concerning her nationality. As you see, flawed, not failed. We're going to be talking about Ruth the Moabitess, Naomi, her daughter-in-law. Now, around this time, Ruth is born in the time period of the Judges, which should speak volumes in itself. This is around 1000 BC. I'm just going to look at a couple of things here concerning the time of the Judges. We look in Judges chapter 17, verses 6. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." This chapter we meet Micah, who appears to be living in the region of the tribe of Ephraim, who would pay a Levite to be his personal priest. Look over in the chapter 18. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel. This chapter would show how the tribe of Dan, or the Danites, would persuade the priest to be their priest and set up a graven image that was taken from Micah. Chapter over, 19, it says, and it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel. This chapter, which to me emphasizes the vivid picture of how bad things can get without God. Now, I won't go into detail about that specific chapter, but I will say things are pretty much at an all-time low. And finally, you look over in Judges chapter 21, verses 25. It says, basically, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, I count 4 times that wording, there being no king in Israel, is used. No one to truly guide them, no one to truly lead them as Joshua or Moses, and maybe a select few of the judges would have done to point them to God, who is truly the King of Kings. The severity of it all, not having a knowledge of God, not trusting in the Lord with all your might, and leaning on your own understanding can get you in an all-time low, without hope, but utter confusion and chaos. For the most part, the children of Israel are erring, and there seems to be no hope that someone would stop this pattern of sin that seems to have this dominion over the people of God as they're constantly falling over and over and over again. This is the time period our beloved Ruth is living in. Now, turn me, if you would, to the book of Ruth. We're going to go ahead and start reading in chapter 1. Book of Ruth, chapter 1, beginning in verses number 1. It reads, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Verse 3, then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the woman of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Verse 5, then both Mahlon and Chilion died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Verse 7, therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Now, just a little recap. We meet a man by the name of Elimelech and his wife Naomi. They have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And this family here would decide to move to Moab. Or why would they move to Moab? Because there was a famine in the land of Bethlehem, Judah, where they were from. And while in the land of Moab, we see that Elimelech ends up dying. And the 2 sons would take up wives out of Moab, that being Orpah and our beloved Ruth. Now, after about a decade or so would pass, Naomi's sons would die as well. This is all happening, mind you, in Moab. Naomi would experience the loss of not 1, not 2, but 3 of her loved ones, and is left with Orpah and Ruth, her daughters-in-law. And after all this occurs, in 6 and 7 of chapter 1 of Ruth, it says, then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people and given them bread. Verse 7, wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return into the land of Judah. Now we can see that as they are returning to Judah, as verse 7 would indicate, somewhere along the way, somewhere on the way to Judah, as they left Moab, some events would occur. It would seem Naomi would have a change of thought. Along the way. So I want to start off by saying, along the way, on the way to Bethlehem of Judah from coming from Moab, we'll see that Naomi kind of gets discouraged in a way. We see that she's probably recounting everything that has happened. She has lost a husband of old age. It's not just someone that she just got with, not a day or a year ago. She's probably been with him for quite some time. We have two accounts where we see that they made two big decisions. First they were in a whole famine together, and then they would make the move to Moab. And I don't really know how long that would be, but we see that is something that they would go to together. And so that's bearing down on her that she has lost her husband of old age. In a sense, they've been together. So not only that, but she's also lost her two sons, which based off of that time period, with no man would make it difficult to provide and to be provided for. And now she's just stuck with the in-laws. Terrible, right? No, I'm playing. So they start off in verse 7, leaving towards Judah as her daughters-in-law, although all of their husbands were dead. And somewhere along the way, as we see in verse 8, Naomi would say to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to her mother's house. Go back to the country Moab." Now, mind you, given everything that's happened, she may be thinking, "Oh, well, my husband and your husbands are dead. So we no longer are bound under the marriage law. And we can cut ties here. This will relieve me of that burden." She's recounting everything that's happened, and she's like, "Well, I'm already going through a lot." She's probably thinking, "Oh, well, if Ruth and Orpah, if I don't have to take care of them, then that would kind of ease the burden in a way." So she's recounting all of this. And that's why I start off saying that she is discouraged. And after bidding Orpah and Ruth salutations, she would then kiss them both and aims to send them away. But both disregard her statement at first to go back to their mothers until Naomi explains to them the reason they should go. Verses 11 of Ruth chapter 1, it says, "And Naomi said, 'Turn again, my daughters. Why will ye go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands?' Verse 12, "Turn again, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have an husband." So as we see, Naomi becomes discouraged. The second event, we see that Orpah would end up leaving. No, she's following after her mother's orders. And at first we see that Orpah and Ruth both, they don't take the notion to leave at first, but we see afterwards with a little more persuasion and a little logic and reasoning by Naomi, whether she was acting out of feelings or whatever it was, we see that persuaded Orpah to go back home. And whether Orpah, she traveled with them probably one day, or they were probably halfway there, or even 75% of the way, Orpah wouldn't make it to Judah. She would go back. And the third one we see, Ruth stays. Naomi is discouraged, Orpah leaves, and Ruth stays. And this all happens on the way to Judah. Now, Naomi may have been frustrated, tired with so much to think about and handle, not just for herself, once again, but for both Orpah and Ruth. And although she would use some reasoning for why Orpah and Ruth should leave her, Orpah leaves, but Ruth stays anyway. And just as Orpah ends up leaving, she goes back to the land of Moab, Ruth decides to stay. So after Naomi sees that Ruth is persistent, first she's telling her, "Well, go back. Just go back with your sister. Don't follow me." But we see that Ruth ends up staying, and we see the famous words by Ruth. Verse 16 and 17, it says, "But Ruth said, 'Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. For wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God.' Verse 17, 'Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me.'" And that's such a strong comment and statement to be made by Ruth. And it's lovely, and it's, like I say, it's a really strong statement. And although it's a strong statement, we can see that, it's one thing to say something, but we will see through the end of the chapter that Ruth is true to her word. of leaving her country and following her mother-in-law to be with her people and to serve her God. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God, is Ruth's words. In some ways, you could say Orpah was probably doing the right thing and obeying her mother-in-law, urging her to go back to her land, go back to her people. And Ruth, on the other hand, would probably seem more so disobedient and a little clingy. You know, her mother is telling her, go back to your land. But she says no. She says, I will follow after you. Your people shall be my people, and your God will be my God. You know, so as Ruth would seem to be more so disobedient and a little clingy, that's not the case of Ruth. That's not the problem with Ruth. She rather proves to be loyal and committed and to not be separated from her mother-in-law. Think about it in our society today. We were present for a type of Q&A interview with our brothers Kevin Flawed and Brian Buzan, and a question was asked about there being a time where certain orders were not to be obeyed because the person was acting off of feelings and emotions rather than what the law would require. And as we learned from Brian, it's not the best idea to follow orders merely based off of that person's emotion. So we see at the end, Naomi is left with only Ruth at her side. And this all happens on the way to Judah. Now, going back to the time of the judges concept, that there was no king in Israel that at that time, and every man did what was right in their own eyes. The Israelites may have treated their own people with disrespect because, again, there was no king and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And if you get a chance to read through the book of Judges, you'll see just how bad it gets for God's people when man look to themselves as judge, jury, and bailiff. They were to treat others with love, not stealing, not killing, not lying, not coveting or making graven images and having other gods. All these things that were being done did not resemble the love of God. Did not resemble the love of God being shown to one another. And these are what many took part in. And I bring that up because if they're doing that to one another, if they're doing that to their brothers and sisters, those that are family, how much more to a foreigner? How much more to a foreigner? How much more would the Israelites have wanted to treat a foreigner with disrespect than their own people in this time period? Like I said, in the time of the judges, they're doing whatever they think is right in their own eyes. God's law would say in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33, it says, "And if a stranger sojourn with thee in your land, you shall not vex him. But a stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you. And thou shalt love him as thyself. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." Now, this is God's commandment. But again, the people were doing what was right in their own eyes and not the eyes of God. Ruth, the Moabitess. So we want to start off by looking at the history of the Moabites. So we're going to start off looking at the father of the Moabites. If you look at Genesis chapter 19, you'll have to turn there. But Genesis chapter 19, verses 34 through 37, after getting their father drunk, Lot's daughters would then have relations with them. And then out of it, Moab would be born. It would be born out of cunningness from the daughters of Lot through drunkenness and exploit. So right now, it's already starting off at a negative start. Afterwards, we see the attempted cursing from the Moabites in Numbers chapter 22. Balak, king of Moab, would try to convince Balaam, a prophet, to curse the Israelites. And because of that, the Moabites weren't even allowed to enter into the congregation of the Lord. You look at Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3 through 6. It says, "An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. Because they met you not with bread and with water in the way, when ye come forth out of Egypt. And because they hired against thee Balaam the son of Beor of Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse thee. Nevertheless, the Lord thy God would not hearken unto Balaam, But the Lord thy God turned the curse into a blessing unto thee, because the Lord thy God loved thee. Verse 6, thou shalt not seek their peace, nor their prosperity, all thy days forever. The serving of Eglon, king of Moab. In Judges chapter 3, verses 12, it says, And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. Verse 13, And he gathered unto him the children of Ammon and Amalek, and went and smote Israel, and possessed the city of palm trees. So the children of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. All these different things that are happening. And this is all just before the time of Ruth. So we see the Moabites were perpetual and sworn enemies. The relationship between the Moabites and the Israelites is not good. They were sworn enemies. Now imagine Naomi bringing Ruth into Bethlehem. And as all the people are looking at Naomi, they would also see Ruth. You ever go into a place you haven't been before? Maybe you're going to a new job and you're being introduced, to everyone on the team by the person you know. And that person, they end up shaking hands and they joking around and they're smiling with the other team members. But right when they see you, right when they get introduced to you, that smile just turns into a straight face and they're probably looking at you with dissatisfaction. You may catch a glance in the back. The people that are working, they stop working and they're looking at you and they're probably talking behind your back. At this point, you probably feel uncomfortable, uneasy, and you just want to turn around. And that's a question we need to think about tonight is, are we like that at university? Are we like that in the Lord's church? When a visitor comes in for the first time or maybe even the 50th time, probably not a Christian and seeking refuge because they followed behind someone they knew that attends here. Do we seek to make them feel welcome? Or are we talking behind their back about their attire and where they came from in a negative way? It's just something we need to think about. In chapter 2, Ruth asked her mother-in-law if she could glean from the fields to gather what little food she could for Naomi and her. And notice, this is usually what she is referred to throughout most of the book. You look in Ruth chapter 2, beginning in verses 5, it says, Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, Whose young woman is this? Whose young woman is this? Verse 6, So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, It is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. The young Moabite woman. Imagine what may have been going through that servant's head or what the young man there would have been thinking. They know that she is a foreigner. She's a young female and she's poor. She's vulnerable and at their mercy before Boaz shows up. Look in verse 8 of chapter 2. Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Verse 9, Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young man that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go unto the vessels, and drink of that which the young man have drawn. Without Boaz charge, without Boaz saying what he said, Ruth could have been in terrible danger. Like I said, she was poor, she was a young female, and she was a foreigner. How much more would the Israelites have wanted to treat a foreigner with disrespect in their own people? Once again, we're in the time of the judges. Everyone is doing what was right in their own eyes. If she would have moved on, if Ruth would have moved on to another field, she could have very well stumbled upon someone completely the opposite of Boaz. Boaz was compassionate and acknowledged God in his law. But if she would have went to another field, then who's to say that she would have stumbled upon someone who was stingy and selfish, someone who didn't acknowledge God or his law? Things could have took a terrible turn for the worse. And reminder, still living in the time of the judges, so it wouldn't be that hard to find someone like that. Besides chapter 1 and Ruth chapter 2, verses 8, instead of just using Ruth, when it refers to Ruth, it's Ruth the Moabitess, or daughter-in-law, Ruth chapter 2, verses 22. And although that may have been the case throughout the Bible for many characters to use their country or trade as their follow-up name, what would Ruth be represented as? We look at some examples in the Bible. We see Jesus, known as Jesus the Christ, John the Baptist, and we see Peter the Apostle. And for the most part, all those are good names. Even the follow-up names behind it, the Christ, the Baptist, the Apostle, those are all good names. But think about it on the flip side. Rahab, the harlot. Simon, the sorcerer. Ruth, the Moabitess. Again, the relationship between the Moabites and the Israelites is not good. Ruth is known by many as Ruth, the Moabitess. People are already judging her without even getting to know her. She may not have any character flaws that are mentioned, but she could have been in trouble just because of who she was. We're in the month of June, which today has been recognized by many in the world as Pride Month. Our brother Josh preached on this concept of pride this month and its destruction that comes behind it. You may be at your job or in your community, and not supporting this pride movement can have its repercussions just because of who you are as a Christian. And truth is, we need to stand firm and be not conformed to this world, but we need to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, that we may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Now, how do we get to this point of there being a month dedicated to pride? We look over in Romans chapter 1, verses 21 through 24, it says, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Verse 24. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Where's the king? Excluding the fact that not all are in the body of Christ and look to God when times get tough, this world has the same mindset it does as in the time of the judges. Everyone doing what was right, everyone doing what is right in their eyes and not the eyes of God, because they have no king. And if they do have a king, it's not God, it's themselves, it's idols. Where's the king? Ruth shows us that we can leave this old life behind. At times, it may require you to physically separate yourself from a sinful lifestyle and surround yourself with others that are associated with people that can help you and that can help me. Look over in Ruth chapter 3. Naomi will end up instructing Ruth to freshen up and meet Boaz after he was eaten and drunken, and laid down, that she should go and cover his feet and lay down there. In humble obedience, Ruth does all that Naomi tells her to do and pleads her case to Boaz for him to perform the duty to redeem the near kinsman. Now, Boaz, he's all for it because of the way Ruth would carry herself. She's not a bad person. The way she's carrying herself, they've heard about her, and we'll talk more about that as we continue on. But Boaz, he likes Ruth for the way she carries herself, and he's all for redeeming her. But he takes heed to the Mosaic law. He takes heed to God's law and informs Ruth of the near kinsman closer than him. Chapter 4, we see where Boaz, he would end up catching up with the near kinsman and informs him on the situation. He tells him in the presence of the elders of the city about this land that Naomi has for sale from her late husband Elimelech and how he can redeem it. Now, the near kinsman, he seems to jump at the opportunity to get the land, but Boaz would inform him also that, look, if you want this land, then you also have to marry Ruth. Why? Because Ruth, she would have a partnership in it because of her husband, her late husband, if you will, Elimelech's son. So if he's wanting to take the land, then he will also have to marry Ruth, the Moabitess. Close relative wanted the land from Ruth, but not Ruth herself. And today, many can take that same approach. They want what you have to bring to the table, but they don't want you as a person. Ruth is poor, she's a widow, and she's a foreigner. And although she's all those things, many do not want her, or many want to mistreat her. But we see that Boaz looks over all of that and sees and wants her because of not where she came from, but who she was and wanted to become. Look at a couple of characteristics of Ruth as we begin to close. She's brave. We'll start off with she's brave because if you go back into chapter 1, we'll see how she has left all that she's known. She's marching. She's here in unknown territory, and she's just following after one person. Now she's beating all these different people. And even as she is in unknown territory, she'll still decide to want to help and to provide for Naomi. She'll ask Naomi that, hey, do you want me to go out in the fields? Let me glean in the fields so I can collect food for you and I. She's in unknown territory, but she is brave enough to do this because she cares for her mother-in-law. Not only is she brave, but she shows humility. After Boaz told her to glean only in his field, she would realize the kindness being shown to her. And in Ruth chapter 2, verses 10, it says, Then she fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? She shows humility because she knows where she comes from and who she is and how people may look at her. So she's saying, why would you take knowledge of me? I'm a foreigner. I'm nothing. She shows humility. Not only that, but she shows virtue. She has virtue. We look at Ruth chapter 3, verses 11, and this will literally be by something Boaz would say himself. It says in Ruth chapter 3, verses 11, And now, my daughter, fear not. I will do to thee all that thou requirest, that being redeeming the near kinsman. He said, Fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requirest, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. So not only is Boaz saying this, he said, look, all these people in the city, they know who you are. You may be Ruth the Moabitess, and some people may have their thoughts about you because they haven't met you. But from what we know, from what you have done, you're a virtuous woman. And that's it in a way kind of remind us of Proverbs chapter 31. And although Ruth, she's not a wife, we can see that she has the characteristics of a good wife. And I can't even see that. I'm going to turn it over here. A wife of noble character, who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. She's precious. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. And notice, she selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. Well, what was Ruth doing? She was working with eager hands to try to help out her mother-in-law, who was already struggling. We see that both of them are widows, so they're already struggling at this time. So she's working with eager hands. It says she is like the merchant ships, bringing her fruit from afar. She gets up while it is still night. She provides food for her family and portions for her female servant. So she's not a wife at this point, but we see that she does have the characteristics of a Proverbs 31 woman. It's hard to find. The price is far above rubies, as the Bible would say. And not only all these characteristics of her being brave, having humility, and being virtuous, not only that, but she wanted to be redeemed. It's one thing when you're going through something, you may want to stay in that same place, and you just want to stay there, and you're not going to get any better. You're not going to try to grow or get out of that situation. Ruth understood that, and she wanted to be redeemed. She didn't want to stay in that place. She didn't want to stay in Moab, but she wanted to be redeemed as she expressed interest in the beginning to make Naomi's people her people and Naomi's God her God. She wanted to become the wife of Boaz. She was obedient and did all that was commanded of her by her mother-in-law for this to come about. And in the end, Ruth the Moabitess became just that. And through God's providence, Boaz was able to restore Ruth. And through Ruth, God was able to bless Naomi and raise her countenance and give joy to a once sad and widowed elderly woman. Boaz and Ruth would have a son and in turn become the great-great-grandmother of King David. Now, Ruth, she could have given up and failed to bring about the son of promise through her bearings because of her flawed heritage, but she decided to leave her old life and be redeemed. God's ultimate plan of salvation to bring a foreigner in the fold. And finally, Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 through 22, it says, So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And when he went in unto her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. And the woman said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. And Naomi took the child, and laid it in her bosom, and became nurse unto it. And the woman, her neighbors, gave it a name, saying, There is a son born to Naomi, and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Verse 18, Now these are the generation of Perez. Perez begat Hezron, and Hezron begat Ram, and Ram begat Amminadab, and Amminadab begat Nahshon, and Nahshon begat Salmon, and Solomon begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed. And Obed, verse 22, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David. Now we'll go ahead and pause there and pick up in the invitation. Thank you all for your time thus far.